This is a journey. Greetings and salutations, people of the YouTube Nation. You are now listening to the premier voice for entertainment and information. And friend. This is part 2 of my series in Black History. Today I wanted to shed some light on somebody who I admire deeply and wish to be half as brave as. Now, I know a lot of people like to look up to Rosa Parks. We all know Rosa Parks and her story, right? In 1954, she refused to get up from the front of the bus to give up her seat to a white man. At that time, segregation was still in effect. Black and white people had different water fountains, schools, etc. Separate but equal, they said. Spoiler alert, it was not equal. Black schools had dilapidated school buildings and received very little funding compared to white schools, which is, incidentally, similar to what is actually happening right now, but I digress. The point being that Miss Parks ended up being arrested that day. The brave action by Miss Parks sparked outrage and served to mobilize people. It could be said that it sparked the civil rights movement in a way because her case was used to challenge the racist South. However, some 70 years prior, another woman would also make history by refusing to get up from her seat in public transportation. Of course, I'm talking about Ida B. Wells. She was a teacher, journalist, organizer, and just around a bad mother. I'm talking Ida B. Wells. It was thanks to her that attitudes about lynching black people began to change. We'll talk about that in a minute. The story goes that in 1884, Ida B. Wells was taking her usual seat on the ladies' coach of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad Company. The train was headed to Memphis, where Wells worked as a teacher at the time. Mind you, this was some 19 years after the 13th Amendment was passed, abolishing slavery, except for cases of punishment for incarceration. But it's not like all that racist sentiment just up and disappeared all of a sudden. This is where what would later be known as Jim Crow laws were starting to be implemented. So, back to the scene. Ms. Wells was minding her own business, sitting at the first class ticket she bought. Tee-hee-hee. When all of a sudden, a goofy goober, who was actually the conductor, demanded she get up and head to the colors section. Well, of course she refused. Why would she? She paid good money for that ticket. All of a sudden, the goon tried to grab her and physically move her to the collar section. So the goon realized that was a mistake, though, because the lady bit him on the hand. The conductor had to call 2 of his accomplices to move her to the collar section. Mind you, she was a tiny lady, about 4'6". Shaking my head, bro. It took 3 grown men to give her the old jazz treatment. She rightly felt violated, so she decided to sue the company for damages. And she ended up winning the case. She felt ecstatic. She was overjoyed. So much so that she decided to start her journalistic career. She wrote an article in the Baptist Weekly called The Living Way. She stated that if black people stood up for their rights, they would be preserved because they are granted in the Reconstruction legislation. Unfortunately, the South's counter-revolution was in full swing. The legal disenfranchisement through things like literacy tests and segregation was starting to take form. Now, the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad Company appealed to a higher court. Wells was the first African American to challenge the 1883 nullification of the Civil Rights Bill passed during Reconstruction. Had she won, it would have been monumental. Unfortunately, the Tennessee Supreme Court reversed the decision. It was bad enough that she had to take an L in the court case, but I think at that moment, Ida B. Wells was starting to lose faith in the American justice system. It seems naive now, but in the late 1880s, many black people believed that racial injustice was the work of poor whites, something that could successfully be challenged in a court of law. It was their faith in the system that steeled their determination to be quote-unquote worthy citizens, despite the bitter experience of slavery and discrimination. Hey, after all, black people were making tremendous economic progress during the Reconstruction era, the period immediately after the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished, again, except for cases of punishment for incarceration. The frustration brought about by the court decision would then bring her a focus that she would channel through journalism. She would begin to write weekly articles in the Living Way. Her articles became so popular that they would be picked up by other black publications around the country. In 1891, she managed to buy a controlling stake in the publication Free Speech. It was a great time for her to do so as well because she had just been let go as a teacher. She was let go because she published an expose on the Memphis school system. She was probably tired of teaching anyway. Sounds familiar. So she went through Arkansas, Mississippi, and Tennessee in order to increase her newspaper circulation. She increased her subscriber count to 3,500. Must be nice. Within a year, she was earning the same wage she earned as a teacher. In the first chapter of her book, When and Where I Enter, Paula Giddins, by the way, this is where I'm taking a lot of this information from. Paula Giddins wrote about the lynching of 3 African American men in 1892, a mile outside of Memphis, Tennessee. Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart were killed by a mob of angry whites. You see, this was brewing, this was escalating for a while. The 3 black men had gone into business for themselves, setting up the People's Grocery. Moss had used the money that he earned as a mailman and set up business for himself along with his 2 partners. The People's Grocery was a source for resentment for white folk because it took business away from the white store owner who had grown used to having a monopoly on black business. As a result, the white owner of the competing store initiated a series of provocations that ended up with an attack of armed thugs one Saturday evening. Unlucky for them, that Saturday evening the store was full of black men that were packing more heat than a barbecue on the 4th of July. They proceeded to get lit up like a Christmas tree. During the aftermath, Moss, McDowell, and Stewart were arrested, because of course they were. As you might imagine, there was a lot of outrage. The white press in Memphis painted the men who were defending themselves as brutes, criminals who attacked innocent whites. Sound familiar? If the men died, white people warned that there would be a bloodletting. White people were allowed to enter the jail where the black men were held in order to look them over. Outside, black men stood vigil to discourage mob violence. The vigil ended when it was reported that the 3 white men would survive. Unfortunately, they were wrong. In a pre-dawn raid, the 3 men were taken out of their cells, strapped to an engine of a train, and lynched. Afterward, a judge issued an order to the sheriff to shoot any black demonstrators that were deemed to be causing trouble, and prohibited the sale of guns to blacks. In 1892 alone, there had been 255 lynchings, more than the previous year. Mind you, it was only March. During this time, the quote-unquote new Negro crime was used as justification to explain the strange, dark-skinned fruit hanging from the southern trees. Philip A. Bruce was a Harvard graduate historian as well as the son of a plantation owner who lorded over 500 slaves. Furthermore, he was also the nephew of the Confederacy's former Secretary of War. Bruce defined the new Negro crime in his 1889 paper titled The Plantation of the Negro as a Free Man. He argued that black people, cut off from the spirit of war society, had regressed to a primitive and thus criminal state. Without the master's influence, the black folk were now even closer to the quote-unquote African type that slaves had been. Found something strangely alluring and seductive about the appearance of white women. He further argued that this was true regardless of your class, so from the black legislator to the college graduate teacher to the common laborer. Another publication, the Harper Weekly, included that middle-class blacks were a greater threat since they were more likely to aim at social equality and to lose the awe in which, in slavery times, black men had learned to respect the women of the so-called superior race. That was the new Negro crime. Jane Addams, a reformer and advocate for women's suffrage, was opposed to lynching but did believe that black men were guilty of that crime. Even abolitionist Frederick Douglass began to believe that there was an increase in lasciviousness on the part of the Negroes. Although she had her doubts, because lynchings were contrary to law and order, Ida B. Wells also largely believed that the brutes who were lynched largely deserved it. That was not the case for Thomas Moss. Ida B. Wells didn't have many friends, but she did consider Ida B. Wells did not have many friends, but she did consider Thomas and his wife Betty friends. Everyone knew that Thomas Miles was a good man, a loving husband, a father, and a sterling citizen. His only crime was succeeding at business and then defending said business. That makes you wonder if Miles was not guilty of crime. Maybe the others were not either. Perhaps, as Wells wrote, lynching was merely an excuse to get rid of the Negroes who were acquiring wealth and property, and thus keeping their race terrorized and keeping the nigger down. For several months, she researched over 700 lynchings that had taken place over the last decade. Only a third of the murdered blacks were even accused of sexual assault, much less guilty of it. Most were killed for crimes such as incendiarism, race prejudice, and quarreling with whites. So fast forward to over a century later, things are pretty much the same, except now it's the state that's directly carrying out these executions. I say all that to mean, though, that Ida B. Wells did contribute a lot, and I could keep talking about her, but I just wanted to shed some light about the great things that she did in the past, right? And again, I go by the name of Omar Arpanada, aka Arpaner, aka your poor leftist teacher. Thank you for flying Arpaner. Hope to see you again soon. Peace.